Well, good afternoon. We're going to talk about James Madison. I think Lynn and I agree that he is one of the greatest Americans and certainly one of the greatest founders. He had an extraordinary influence on our government, and he had a capacity for thinking about politics that I think was rare, combined with the ability to deal with nitty-gritty politics. Although I disagree with Lynn, because in her magnificent book, one of the best single-volume biographies of Madison that we have, she says that he is a creative genius akin to Einstein and Mozart. I don't go that far, but I am glad that she supports Madison.
Well, I think, I've been trying to think of the analogy. Is it like, someone who sort of thinks they might want to be an artist? And so they go and they look at some paintings, and they're old paintings, but they try to find relevance in them. And then, they get themselves a brush and some paper, and they go after it a little bit. What this is analogous to is, first of all, Madison's familiarity with the past, what had worked in the past. And the second thing it's analogous to is he had some experience at painting in government. But how did he take that and make it into the Constitution? I know he wasn't solely responsible. Into the Bill of Rights, he was almost solely responsible. But to take these things and turn them into the plan that we still follow for the country, isn't that genius?
Well, it's genius, and certainly of a certain level. But I don't think he's quite the level of Mozart. But he is extraordinary. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with James Madison, but nobody was more responsible for the federal Constitution. Now, as you know, the Declaration of Independence was 1776, and all of the states promptly wrote state constitutions. And then they created something called the Articles of Confederation, which I think the best way to understand that is to think of it as sort of like the EU. Each of those states, like England, France, Germany, each of the states, Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, came together in this confederation, which is a treaty. And that's what it was, a signed treaty. And that's what we had. Now, the Constitution comes in 1787, almost a decade later, but nobody, and I mean no one, in 1776 anticipated the kind of strong national government that was created by the federal Constitution. And you know that it's a strong government because it's the same government we live under. But nobody dreamed about it. So and they in fact said it was impossible to have a large republic. It was, Montesquieu had said republics have to be small and homogeneous. And so nobody thought about the kind of government that was created. So why did it happen? We tend to take it for granted. We should not. Something awful happened in that decade. And Madison is the person who wrote about what was awful in his mind. And the only way I would describe it is he saw an excess of democracy in the state legislatures. They were running amok, and he wrote out a little document called The Vices of the Political System of the United States. It was never published. It was his working paper describing what was wrong with the United States, and he said the state legislatures are running amok. They're too democratic. They're passing bad legislation, multiple legislation. More laws, he said, have been passed in the last 10 years. And he wrote this in April of 1787. That is a month or so before the meeting in Philadelphia in the convention. And he said they're passing more laws than existed in the entire colonial period, have been published in the last decade. And the laws were constantly changing, mutability, the multiplicity, the mutability, and the injustice of state laws. And what he meant by the injustice was majorities were passing laws that were hurting minorities, in particular creditors. Not a very sympathetic minority, but nonetheless the principle he raised was crucial. And the Constitution became, in his mind, a device to protect these minorities from rampaging majorities without at the same time repudiating the idea of majoritarianism, because that would be un-Republican. So in the end, which is what he says in the Federalist Papers, I want a Republican remedy for Republican ills. And that is the brilliance, I think, of Madison.
I'm not sure how to follow that really wonderful analysis, Gordon. I love your latest book, and Gordon is the dean of American historians and the world expert on Madison, so you can imagine I'm a little nervous up here. An interesting thing, though, is when the Constitution was finished, Madison didn't like it. He said to himself, and probably to a lot of folks around him, this Constitution is entirely unable to control the states. That the states were still going to be running around taxing each other, maybe declaring war on each other, and the Constitution wasn't going to stop that at all. It took him a couple of weeks, and then he said, well, the Constitution isn't perfect, but it is so much better than the opposite, so much better than the Articles of the Confederation that, I'm all in. And he and Hamilton, in a short-lived alliance, wrote the Federalist Papers together. Hamilton really believed in a government for the rich and well-born, I think. He said that. And he simply wanted a government that appalled Madison because it was so strong. So people have criticized Madison. Here on the one hand, he doesn't like the Constitution because the central government isn't strong enough to sit on the states. And on the other hand, he sets up this big rivalry with Hamilton and eventually with Washington over his concern that the federal government would sit on us all.
Right. I think there is what we might call a Madison problem, because in the 1780s, he's worried about the states running amok, and the solution to that is a strong federal government. When you get to the 1790s, he's worried about the federal government, and the solution becomes the states. His Virginia Resolution in 1798 is a state solution to this rampaging federal government. So there is a Madison problem. How did he change his mind? I think the issue is one of, he had no idea of what Hamilton was up to. They both wanted a stronger federal government, but Hamilton really wants a European-type government with a standing army, a bureaucracy, the kind of government that existed in Great Britain or France, and that would in time be able to take on the European states on their own terms. Madison has a very different notion of the federal government. If you read his 10th Federalist, which is, I suppose, one of the great documents of American history, where he outlines what he thinks is the problem and the solution, he has an adjudicatory notion of the federal government. It's going to be a kind of umpire, and he wants to see the government acting in a disinterested way to settle conflicts in a judge-like way, and it's not at all the kind of strong European-type fiscal military state that Hamilton had in mind. That's what was frightening to him and to Jefferson, and they go into opposition. And then, of course, you have the creation of the two parties, the Federalists on one hand, with Hamilton and Washington, and John Adams sort of following behind, and then Jefferson and Madison. And Madison is really the leader. Beneath the surface, he's the one who organizes the Republican Party. Jefferson becomes the leader, the titular leader, but I think Madison is far more important as a politician.
The little engine that
Right.
moved the thing along. Gordon and I were having a very interesting discussion in the green room about Madison and women. I think that's a pretty interesting discussion. Where shall we start? His first love was a young woman named Kitty Floyd. Her father was a congressman, and they were living in the same boarding house with Madison. And he fell head over heels. I think, Jefferson thought he wasn't being forceful enough, because Jefferson got into the act, talked to Kitty, said, he really is in love with you. You should pay some attention. It didn't work. She jilted him, and he was really disconsolate.
Did you mention that Kitty was 15 years old?
Yeah, well.
Madison was 32, I think, at the time.
I think that by the time he married Dolly, it was a similar age
right.
discrepancy, but 15, as you and I were talking,
But-
was above the age of consent
Well-
in the 18th, early 19th centuries. So that's Kitty Floyd. Gordon, did you mention that there were some others?
Well, I was told by John Meacham, who is
Oh.
presently writing a book about Dolly and Jimmy Madison, that he says there are two others. And I said, well, I've never heard of them. And he says, well, he was trying. He had a very difficult time with women. He was so excited about this arrangement with Kitty Floyd because I think people were setting it up for him. He did not know how to approach women. Even Dolly was a setup, wasn't it? They were trying to fix him up always through his whole career. And so I don't know about these other two women, but you'll have to wait for Meacham's book to find out all about them. But he was very comfortable with small groups of men. He loved to tell dirty jokes. We've never got any of these jokes. They didn't get passed down, but people did talk about his love of smutty stories. He was very comfortable with small groups, but I don't think he was he was a reserved and private man in many ways, wasn't he? Don't you think?
Yes, indeed. And sometimes I think we talk about a contradictory problem with Madison. How is it possible that the least glamorous of the founders married the most glamorous woman of the age? I mean, it is totally unpredictable. You would have thought he would have gone for, someone a little more of a homebody. But Dolly was something. And I remember writing my Madison book, I could hardly wait to get to the chapters about Dolly. Because, you don't have to think about policy and so on. You just have this woman who is totally extraordinary. Most women at the time, burned their letters and wouldn't talk publicly, thought that would be unfeminine to do that. But here's Dolly. She doesn't only not burn her letters, she makes sure to save them for posterity. And her dress, she always had tall ostrich plumes in her turban. She always wore turbans. And she was probably 5'8". So with the turban and the peacock feathers, she was probably a foot taller than her husband. and I don't think he cared at all.
No. Well, I think Dolly was a widow, and she really, when the opportunity, this is my take on it, a chance to marry James Madison, wow, she jumped at it, and she became the hostess of the great hostess of D.C. And everyone was delighted to go to the White House and experience a dinner. Jimmy, and that's what people called him, who knew him, did not like big crowds. He would not sit at the head of the table. He let his secretary sit at one end of the table, and Dolly was at the other, and he was in the middle somewhere, and he let Dolly control the conversation of the dinner party. That's the kind of woman she loved it. She was in her glory, and that, I think, was probably he was happy to have that kind of relationship. She would do all of the social work, and he could concentrate in reading his history books.
Well, if you've led a public life, you're obligated to spend lots of time talking to people, some of whom you may never have met before. And that has a certain pressure attached to it that I think she relieved him of. He could sit and think about Thucydides while the dinner conversation was going in a very different direction. So I think she provided him ease, but she also just provided him with energy and life, especially in their retirement. There are wonderful word pictures of them running on the veranda at Montpelier, and he, I think, had the most pleasant retirement. He left the White House in a cloud of glory.
Right.
The War of 1812, when we kind of won it, the Jackson element at New Orleans wasn't really us winning it, but it kind of made us feel good about it. And he left with that glory hanging on him. He, like the others, went broke. And in the end, Dolly had to sell Montpelier and all the enslaved people there. So in the end, it was a little sad, but he had a great retirement because of Dolly.
Montpelier has been recently, within the last decade or so, open to tourists in a way that kind of rivals. It's nowhere near the rival of Monticello, but it's not too far away, and it's open now for visitors. So Madison's position, I think, in the founding will go up. He ended the war with a great glory, and there are apparently more towns and counties and places in the United States named after Madison than any other single president, which is a little curious, except that was a period of tremendous demographic expansion by the American people. And so they're opening up new places all over the country, and naturally they think about this president who had just won, so to speak, the War of 1812. I think one point that needs to be emphasized that I think gets forgotten by many historians, because they have criticized Madison for his inept performance during the war. We lost a lot of battles in Canada, and we really weren't doing very well until Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans. But you have to understand and every single president that we've had during wartime has enhanced the executive authority tremendously. You know what Lincoln did, you know what FDR did, you know what Wilson did, and subsequent wars, the same thing. Truman in the Korean War. The presidency naturally gets expanded during wartime, but not under James Madison. He refused, under Republican principles, I am not going to enhance my authority. The cost will be too high to do that. Better to lose some battles than to enhance and become an unrepublican government. And so that's why he's been criticized by historians, but I think mistakenly so, because I think he was trying to preserve a limited presidency, and that's never been fully appreciated.
He was also very keen on free speech, more than Jefferson by quite a measure. He didn't think that wartime meant you should go arrest people who were clearly guilty of sedition, which would have basically meant arresting all of New England. They did not like the War of 1812 and did many things to undermine it. There's a story about, I think it's Stephen Decatur, a famous ship captain of the war. He saw blue lights when he was sailing off the coast of, I'm not sure where in New England, but it was New England. Blue lights flashing on the shore, and everyone concluded the blue lights were to warn the British that the American ships were in the vicinity. But that brings up another point. The war had very few successes on land, but it was a great success on the ocean. The Constitution managed to destroy the Guerriere, this wonderful victory over the British, who had the largest navy in the world. There was Decatur, of course, who had this amazing victory down near the Azores, who somehow he managed to haul the ship home that he knocked out of commission. Somebody took the flag of the ship Macedonian and rushed it to Washington. There was a great ball going on, and in comes the messenger with the flag of the Macedonian. Can you imagine the thrill that was for the crowd? So there were great victories at sea, which I think helped keep the nation together, as well as Madison did, and part of it was restraint.
One other thing about James Madison and you mentioned this with the Bill of Rights. He is the one person responsible for the Bill of Rights. And what he was most...
I'm clicking. Thank you. They took... But I'm still clicking.
Am I
Hello?
okay?
Yeah.
He was responsible for the Bill of Rights. What in particular he was interested in was freedom of religion. And he, in Virginia, in 1785, shepherded Thomas Jefferson's bill for religious freedom. Jefferson, of course, was abroad as minister to France, and he had written this important document affirming religious freedom in 1779. And Madison worked it through the legislature. And he had an important insight as to why it would work. And this made the United States the freest country in the world. Holland was noted for a certain amount of toleration, but what Madison said, we're going beyond toleration. Toleration implies an establishment which tolerates other religious sects, but we're not going to do that. We're going to neutralize the state in religious matters. Well, no one in the history of the world had ever thought about religion in those terms. And what Madison's insight came from the fact of the reality of Virginia. He said, we could never have gotten this bill through if there hadn't been a bunch of Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and Quakers who disliked the Episcopal establishment. And it's the competition among the various groups that enabled us to get this bill through. If the Presbyterians could have been sure that they would be the established church, they would have been happy to be one. So to neutralize the state in religious matters was an extraordinary moment in our history. I was in a conference in Prague in 2006 discussing this bill, Jefferson's bill for religious freedom. And we had scholars from England, from the United States, and from Europe, but also two Muslims, one from Iran and one from Indonesia. And the Europeans, the Westerners, all understood the idea of neutralizing religion because it's happened in reality. But the two Muslim scholars found that incomprehensible. If religion is important, then the state must be involved in it. That was the line they took. So this was an extraordinary moment in 1785, an extraordinary moment in the history of the West, to have the state neutralized in religion. And it didn't mean that religion was not important, because no state was more, no government, no world, no country was more religious than the United States in the Second Great Awakening that occurred in the early 19th century. So you had the combination of religious enthusiasm without state control, and that is a secret that we've valued through our whole history.
I think one of the episodes in Madison's career that people really find compelling is the fact that he oversaw the burning of Washington. Now, maybe some of you think that's not such a bad idea, but but think of this: it happened on his watch, and he was reelected. He was reelected earlier, wasn't he, Gordon? Thank you for not correcting me. But he left office, in this cloud of glory. Why do you think? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how is it that a president could oversee the burning of the city of Washington and come out of that well?
Well, of course, the enemy was Great Britain, and the United States had a very difficult problem dealing with Great Britain because our rebellion was an unusual one. It was not like, say, the Algerians breaking away from France in the 1960s. Here was a country that spoke the same language, had the same culture. We had shared the same culture for 200 years. How do you establish your nationality if you don't differ from the mother country? It was no problem for the Algerians differing from France. They had different religion, they had a different ethnicity. But how do you separate the Americans from the English? And that was a problem that the Americans faced in the War of 1812, and they came out of it feeling that they had established their Americanism. They felt more patriotic, and that, I think, is what helped Madison's reputation, that he somehow was expressing that distinctive American character, even though in many respects we were indistinguishable from the English.
In fact, one of the precipitating causes of the war was that the English treated us as though the revolution never happened, as though we were still a colony. So they would seize our ships, they'd stop our ships and take sailors off that sounded vaguely English, and impress them into the British Navy. They blockaded our harbors. It was insulting. And I think that pride might have had something to do with it. By gosh, we have shown that we are truly a nation, and we managed to take on the most powerful nation in the world and somehow prevail. I think they thought they were prevailing.
Well, yes, it was a kind of draw, but I think as you mentioned, the Battle of New Orleans made us feel because Jackson defeated a huge invading British army, a formidable army that lost had thousands of casualties, and we had casualties in the hundreds, or less than 100, and so it was such a one-sided victory that it made the people of America. Of course, the irony was the battle occurred after the peace had been signed. The peace had been signed on Christmas Eve in 1814, but the Battle of New Orleans occurred in early January of 1815. But we didn't have radio or television or any means of communicating that fast, so that the battle was fought without need.
Well, I don't know. You know, that finishing touch to the war really made it something that people at the time were very proud of. Back to the burning of Washington, I wonder if part of the reason that, you know, people weren't as upset about it as they might be is it was really just a little village. You know, it wasn't very much. Now, there is the fact that they burnt the White House and the fact that they burnt the Capitol, but it wasn't as though, you know, they burnt New York today or Washington today, so it wasn't quite that big a deal. I would just suggest to all of you, read all of Gordon's books about James Madison, and you will become a believer. I think I'm a more fervent believer than
Well,
you.
I think we have to to understand the burning of Washington, you have to look at it a little bit from the British point of view. We had invaded Canada, which was, of course, British and not independent yet. And we burned the city of York, which is present-day Toronto, which was their capital. We burned it twice. So there was a little bit of revenge in their burning of Washington, D.C. In the War of 1812.
In 1976, it was 1987, the bicentennial of the Constitution, the Queen came to the United States, and I happened to be lucky enough to be in the little circle of people around her. She was the first person that ever made me realize we had burnt York, because we were showing her the burned pieces of wood you can still see in the Capitol, and she said, well, you did something very bad to York. So I was very glad to learn that lesson, which, of course, is since seared in my brain.
Well, what's interesting about American history, up until about the 1890s, the principal enemy of the United States was England. Yes. Of course, it was the dominant power in Europe all through that period. So we had a really hostile relationship with the country that spoke the same language. But by the 1890s, there was a reconciliation, which prepared the way, I think, for Wilson's decision to come into the war on the side of the Allies in 1917. Again, another irony, and I think history is full of ironies. If we had not entered the war, then the Germans and the French and English would have fought to a standstill, and there would not have been a Versailles-type treaty. And Hitler would not have been able to take advantage of the defeat that the Germans experienced. As you perhaps know, Germany was not invited to the peace conference, and yet Germany had never been invaded. The war was fought entirely on Belgian and French lands. This is World War I we're talking about. And the Germans had never been invaded, and so they felt that this treaty, which was imposed on them by the Allies, Wilson included, was an unjust treaty, and that was Hitler's. He used that to rise to. So the ironies of our invasion, of our intervention in World War I, all you can think of is history is one series of ironies after another.
Yes, and including the idea that he was the president who saw the burning of Washington, and went on to great applause. It was John Adams who said, "There has never been a better government." This is a paraphrase,
right.
as I'm sure you'll know. There's never been a better government in the United States than the one we have now. Now, of course, that meant Washington, and that meant Adams himself.
Right.
And Jefferson, so it was quite a compliment,
Yeah,
especially since it meant
but it
Adams
was,
himself.
I think it was Adams's way of needling Jefferson by saying, look, Mr. Madison has more acclaim than any of us, and it was a nice way of razzing Jefferson. One thing we haven't mentioned is slavery.
Yes.
Madison was acutely aware that slavery was incompatible with what the United States wanted to be. And he hoped, as many of the founders did, that slavery would die a natural death. And he was scrupulous, and it was more than any other person, scrupulous in seeing that slavery was not mentioned in the Constitution. No property in man was his theme. We should have no sense that this was somehow legitimated by being in the Constitution. Now, of course, there are elements of the Constitution, the original Constitution, that do suggest slavery, and people were aware of that. But he was scrupulous in keeping the word out. And the future, he hoped, would see the end of the institution. He wasn't sure how it was going to happen, but that was his goal, his aim. Of course, he died. He was the last of the founders, and he died in 1836, was it? And so he's in a position to see how ominous the situation was. I think from the Missouri crisis on, from 1819, 1820, all Americans who were thoughtful realized that this country was going to head for a crisis that was going to break it apart. I think the war was inevitable from that moment on. They both saw that the two sections were, and Madison was depressed, as all the founders were at the end, by what this impossible problem, it seemed, of slavery. But I don't think anyone was more acutely aware of it, because he was himself a slaveholder. And he knew that it was a system of oppression that was incompatible with the government that he had helped create. And that is, I think, maybe the ultimate irony of all of these founders, that they hated the institution but couldn't do anything substantial about it. Although the northern states, of course, did abolish slavery, which was the first abolition movement in the history of the world. All of the northern states, from 1776 to 1804, abolished slavery. No place else in the world was doing that or had done it. And so that has to be recognized. But the South, where slaves were far greater in number and much more deeply entrenched in the economy, could not deal with the institution. And then the war came.
This idea that Madison worked deliberately to keep the word slavery out of the Constitution is becoming an idea that people are talking more about. And certainly if you read the records of the Constitutional Convention, you can see him saying there shall be no property in men. He was perhaps the most thoughtful about slavery. At the end of his life, he's really old now, he's in his 80s, that's not so old. Well, I'm getting there, Gordon. At the end of his life, he and Dolly invited this woman named Harriet Martineau to come visit them at Montpelier. And she was an abolitionist, a suffragette, though that's too early a word to call, a feminist, a woman interested in empowering other women. And they invited her to Montpelier. And she reported on it later. She hated slaves. She hated, the idea of slavery. She went to Montpelier and said she had never met more gracious people. They were completely kind to her. And she had never met a man who at every occasion returned the subject to slavery. I think he was just thinking about it and hoping to get some notion of how things could have been and could be better. Jefferson just quit talking about slavery. He said it's for the younger generation, though he had a fine record in his early life of legislation opposing slavery, but he quickly realized that in his society, in his time, he couldn't get it to to go anyplace. Washington, of course, freed his slaves, or he freed the slaves that belonged to him. He still had a workforce at Mount Vernon because there were 170 slaves that belonged to Martha that he couldn't legally sell. But still, that's a wonderful example, freeing the slaves upon your death. And Madison couldn't do it partly because he couldn't afford it.
Right. Washington was probably one of the wealthiest men in all of America. He owned an enormous amount of land. He sometimes had cash flow problems, but he certainly had the wealth. And he did free his slaves because he was aware of his legacy. He was very conscious of that he was going to be a famous man. He knew that. Europeans were telling him that. And he knew that slavery was a taint on his reputation. He was very concerned about that, and he did free them, but he just didn't throw them out into the world. He provided for training, practical training for all that. They would not be freed at birth. They would be freed at the age of 20 after having been taught a trade. He was insisted on that. He could not free the dower slaves that belonged to Martha, but he did say they would be freed upon they would all be freed upon Martha's death. Well, that was such a scary thing to Martha, because she said, "Ooh, this is not too good." She was afraid of being poisoned, so she freed the slaves very quickly after George died. But it was an extraordinary moment. It's too bad that he hadn't spoken out earlier. He did not speak out against slavery publicly, but the freeing of his slaves in 1799 and the reading of his will did have an effect. And everybody knew, at that point at least, that slavery was wrong and was totally incompatible with the Revolution. It's only later that you have defenses of slavery by Calhoun and that generation. But the revolutionary generation knew that slavery was wrong and only wished they could do more to solve it, to get rid of it.
Their letters are full of references to slavery as a stain, a fatal stain on the country, a blight. It is one of those interesting moments in history where you have people acting heroically on the one hand, creating the government that we know today that has survived for this many years, and on the other hand, practicing in their lives something that was totally anathema to that. So it's an interesting moment in history to see these contradictions.
One thing that Lynn and I were talking about, and we only have a few minutes left, was the extraordinary nature of Virginia society. When you think about a society, Virginia was by far the largest state in the Union and by far the most powerful state that's ever existed. We'd never had a state that dominated the country as did Virginia. So it's not surprising that 4 out of our first 5 presidents were Virginians, that the commander-in-chief was a Virginian, the chief justice that dominated the country, Marshall, was a Virginian. Virginia dominated the country, but it was a relatively small place, maybe 350, 400,000 white men, about the size of Tulsa, produced Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, George Mason, James Madison, James Monroe, Richard Henry Lee. All of these people came out of this small, has Tulsa produced that kind of leadership? What is the secret? And it really is an interesting problem. There's one historian, Charles Sidner, wrote a book in 1950 or 52, something, called Gentlemen Freeholders, who attempts an answer to this question. And he says it was a nice balance between aristocracy and democracy. They had an elective system, but they also had an aristocracy of sorts. And Madison was part of that aristocracy. He was an interesting figure. He was younger than the others. That's why he lived longer than the rest. And he was kind of utopian at as early as I think in 1777 he tried to run for the new House of Assembly in Virginia, and he was going to do away with the treating that Virginia politicians had been used to. That is, giving out rum to the voters if they elected him. And he was not going to do that. He announced that this was a violation of Republican principles. He lost that election to a tavern keeper. And I think from that moment on, he became much more of a realistic politician.
Well,
don't you think?
That could be. He had trouble getting that congressional seat because the next time, in fact, it was a congressional seat, he ran for it, James Monroe decided to run against him. Patrick Henry was behind all of this.
Oh, you're right.
He
right.
did not like Madison. He politically, I think personally as well. Patrick Henry is such an amazing character to think about. He wore a very bad red wig, and it was commented upon, and a red cape with a lot of black clothes underneath. And he was a ferocious orator. So he was not a fellow you wanted to have against you, but he was against Madison and made his life miserable for quite a while.
He had, of course, Henry had opposed the Constitution.
Yes.
They said to him, well, why didn't you go to the convention? You know, he could have done, because he dominated the state legislature of Virginia. And he says, no, I smelt a rat. And so he didn't go. And so he wanted to punish Madison, because Madison was the person in the convention, the ratifying convention of the Constitution, that gave the most speeches and was the best defender of this new Constitution. They needed ratification by 9 states, and Virginia came very close to turning it down. If Virginia turned it down, that would have been the end, because Virginia was, if they weren't in the Union, then there was no Union. Patrick Henry decided to punish him. Madison wanted to go to the Senate. Well, the state legislatures, as you know, at the outset, elected the members, and Henry said, nix to that. And so then he said, well, I'll have to run for the House. And so what Henry did was gerrymander the district, and then put up this young war hero, James Monroe, to run against him. And Madison, for the first time in his career, had to give a speech, which tells you a lot about the different nature of politics back then. He did not like campaigning. Electioneering, is what they called it, was beneath him. He felt that's almost demagoguery. But his colleague said to him, look, you're going to have to make a speech to your constituents. They're not going to vote for you if you don't make at least one speech. And so he did, and he got into the House. And, of course, in the House of Representatives, he was by far the most important member of that House. And he was also a confidant of Washington. There is this curious situation where Washington says to him, will you write my inaugural address? Or look it over. He wrote one, and it was full of things like, you don't worry about me, I'm not going to be a king and I have no heirs. And Madison says, you can't say that, take that out. And so he wrote this inaugural, and then the House had to respond to the inaugural, and of course, Madison was the person who wrote the response to the House, and then Washington had to respond to the House's response, and Madison wrote that too. So you have this extraordinary situation where James Madison is writing back and forth to himself.
I think of it as his voice was bouncing off every wall. It was kind of that way in the run-up to the convention, where Washington was reluctant to be at the convention and Madison was persuading him. Where it looked as though the Confederation Congress was going to cause trouble, he went through a snowstorm up to New York to calm them down. And then, of course, he got his colleagues together at Philadelphia and made the Virginia Plan the order of the day. He was it Joseph Ellis? Said, if God is in the details, Madison was there first. It's a good line, because that's the kind of fellow he was.
Right. I think if you look over the whole founding era, Washington is by far the most dominant force, because without him the country might not have held together. He certainly was a kind of monarch-like figure. And of course the colonists, you have to understand, had been reared in monarchy. They weren't used to this new democratic Republican kind of system. And so Washington was crucial in playing a kind of surrogate kingship, being a surrogate king. And that's why he was so concerned about that. That's why his first draft of his inaugural address, as I say, he says, look, look, folks, you don't have to worry about me. I have no heirs. I'm not going to pass on this thing to this government to my son and so on. And that's what Madison said. You can't say that. But the fact that he would write that suggests how much monarchy was in the air. So Madison was crucial in maintaining the republicanism of the government, and I think that's important. So Washington was by far the most dominant, but the most effective person through the whole period, I think, was James Madison.
Without doubt, and I'm just glad, Gordon, you had a chance to share your views with this audience and with me. It's never less than a pleasure to have a chance to visit.
You want to read a good single-volume biography of Madison? Lynne Cheney's biography is a great one.
I just began Gordon's new book on Adams and Jefferson. It's wonderful, and this long correspondence they had at the end of their lives. Well, it started actually pretty early, but thank you for your many, many contributions.
Thank you.